He shaped the practice output since then. And what's interesting about Patrik is that he has both diploma in architecture as well as a PhD in philosophy, which makes him a very interesting guy to talk to. He has been teaching at the University of Illinois, Columbia, and Harvard University, and he's very vocal for his in his support for market urbanism and anarcho-capitalism as a philosophy. So join me in welcoming Patrik Schumacher.
Well, thanks for having me, guys, and good to be here. So how long are we talking? What is the time frame for this?
We have room for 90 minutes, actually.
Oh, great. Okay, cool. Very cool.
So yeah, usually we have a talk of 45 to 60 minutes, which, you know, what you would talk about, and then we get into a Q&A session, but we're pretty flexible on that.
Yeah, no, we could maybe be more conversational, perhaps. I have prepared some slides as well. I wanted to entertain you a little bit with some images, and because we had some reviews yesterday. I'm teaching at the AA here in London, and I did this kind of high-density market-based urban districts, theoretically market-based because it's just a simulation or a design project. So I'll show a few images of that. I might show a few images of our project in Honduras, Prospera, the attempt to create a free private city. And I wanted to start, I know we're also talking a bit post-COVID, and we're going to talk a lot of politics, I guess, as well. And I mean, what is interesting is that I wanted to start mentioning two things. The first is there will be what we discovered in this period, the last 3.5 months, that we can do a lot from our homes. And more so, we can do a lot remotely. So we have 400 architects working remotely and delivering to deadlines, making presentation, having client meetings, competition juries, and that works very well. The same applies to the teaching. So we have students from around the world, and some of them are actually no longer located in London. Similarly with staff, they're not necessarily only at home in London, but they're sitting at home in other European countries, even further afield. And I find it fascinating because it opens up interesting degrees of freedom. So it's a space for escaping state boundaries, for instance, because you can now collaborate and you're part of a team, and you sit, you know, don't have to cross these awful political borders necessarily, have visas, etc. You might be able to evade taxes. The same as with teaching, and as well, you know, it could kind of soften a bit employment law, right? So because you could have a lot of freelancing and free contracting, and you wouldn't be so easily under anybody's jurisdiction. And I mean, Titus Gebel, who is a great guy in front of mine who has been writing on free private cities and is actually one of the partners in the free private city project Prospera in Honduras, he commented on that, and he put out some messages that this is a point where, you know, people realize they could sit anywhere. They might as well sit in a free private city, which is usually because all the parts of the planet are fully occupied, all the precious parts and high density urbanized parts, which are safe and advanced, are occupied by big states who won't budge. But he found, him and Eric Brimman, one of the other partners, as well as Gabriel Delgado, the three of them with some other partners, found this spot in Honduras. And you might as well sit there and fully integrate back in business, open a school, open a business, or sit there and be employed by Zayed architects or anybody else on the planet. So that revelation of being able to participate productively wherever you are will not be forgotten, let's say. And it immediately makes a place like Honduras Prospera much more attractive. And I think that's an important fact. And as I said, It makes, but even if you stay within Europe or anywhere around the world, you can cross borders more easily. So that's the first point, which I think is positive with respect to liberty. And it makes it harder for states to control what's going on. Of course, they're doing a lot of that right now. And the other thing which we wanted to reflect on and discuss a little bit is the shifts in urbanization patterns we might see coming out of that. I don't believe so much that we're going to be thinking too much about pandemics as the main long-term condition. Maybe a slight caution which compromises public transport a little bit, and that might have an impact. But mostly this idea, what I'm discussing now, that we can be much more flexible in our location of work. So there will be adjustments which the city fabric and city development will have to cope with, that I suspect, for instance, a lot of real estate with respect to work environments and office spaces will lose value. I'm sure that those who had short leases are already out of their spaces. We, of course, with a long lease are having financing empty spaces for months on end. But we realize already that when we now survey our people, that a lot of them are reluctant to come back full time, or discover that we actually don't have to do that. We don't have to fly. That's another aspect. Flying, airports, air travel, there will a lot of disruption, semi-permanent will stay there. And I think what this means, there's also consumption patterns. We realize we can have a lot of delivery going on and don't have to go to restaurants necessarily, famous places of entertainment. There will be a lot of adjustments required. Residences will have to increase perhaps, where you want to have an extra space for a work environment, or maybe in the building you might have to have workspaces, shared workspaces. You might, there's a lot of challenges to the current market. And the way things, my point here is very importantly that the discovery process was only a free market process could deliver. Finding out what would be the right new patterns requires that all the current strict land use zones, typological prescriptions, where is work, where is live, how it's defined, must go. I suspect they won't go, but if they don't go, then the adaptation to the new discoveries will not happen, and we have a lot of frustration. So this idea of a creative destruction, where, for instance, now certain markets have to be reinvented, a lot of business deserve to go bust because they're no longer viable business necessarily, or only part, and new business opportunities open up. You need to have actually let creative destruction and creative rebuilding rip through the economy, so that you also stop things which are no longer demanded for the full extent and viable, in order also to set free those workers, those creatives, those staff, which then needed and have to migrate into the new ventures. And that, unfortunately, I'm afraid won't happen. What will happen instead is that everybody remains kind of scared and locked into their current occupations, and will get the subsidy pump will run, also delivered up by money printing. But this will not will only be a fix for the immediate term. So we're running potentially into a major crisis at some point, or into a major, let's say, stagnation and prosperity reduction. We're actually going to see the zombification of the economy instead of a kind of new flourishing of entrepreneurship. Unfortunately, the way the political process is set up, it will be unable to do what I'm talking about here. And you will see something which happens in Japan for the last 30 years, this zombification. In Japan, actually, you do have for the last 20 years a permanent and continuous reduction in standards of living, reduction in productivity, I mean per capita income it is a substantial 1% shrinkage per year, and that's now ramped up 20% of loss per capita income. And only the kind of stoic Japanese, with a very homogeneous and kind of populace, which is also very much believing in authority, would suffer through something like this. I'm not sure kind of European societies will be able to suffer through this. Maybe they can, but all the worse for all of us. That's what comes to mind, that we need an enormous amount of opening up and flourishing, and all the rules of standards, what is a house, what is a workplace, whether somebody can come and join you, for instance, if you're working from home and an employee, all of that would be illegal very, very quickly. And we did have a category called live work. So whatever you allowed to do needs to be categorized and needs to be over-regularized. There is a live work category, which usually was just game to get more residences into the city. And there's very, very strong prescription with a second entrance and so on, which you can't secondarily build into buildings. So there will be huge problems storing up. And because I believe that the city will be rebuilding in a way that, on the one hand, we could further densify and have people maybe avoiding public transport and using micro mobility. By the way, those scooters are prohibited in London, and they're still flourishing through the cities, but they're absolutely illegal at the moment. More electric cycling, more walking, and a lot of a different way of utilizing the city. All these kind of office spaces, half of them might not be needed. People will come to the office probably 1 or 2 or 3 days per week, and mostly for meetings. And it will be very different utilization of urban space, and the market is the only way to implement that without killing prosperity. If you don't want to go the Japanese way and lose year on year productivity and become poorer and poorer and poorer, we have to allow the market to come through. And actually, China is doing this. And it's fascinating that the Chinese, to restart their economy, have now kind of scrapped and torn up all the, let's say, occupational licenses and business license laws and requirements and regulations for opening up new businesses. And they allow people to open up business in their yard, on the streets. So they encourage people spontaneously, without any license or requirements, to set up shop on the sidewalks, on curbs. A fascinating development. So, and but of course, in the European kind of sclerotic status, and we won't be able to have that. Although some regulations also here, they realized they had to have so the shop opening periods were scrapped, and there were some regulations temporarily suspended even in London to cope with this new situation. So I wanted to make that basic message that we can already foresee that we need enormous new degrees of freedom, and I've been complaining about the overregulation of the real estate, in particular housing market, in the recent decade, which generated that massive housing crisis, skyrocketing prices, which don't allow the co-location synergies to be had, the urban renaissance to really take off in that new economy where you have research, development, finance, marketing, where everybody can become a creative worker, because we don't have to be locked physically into an assembly line and do the work in the green fields. But also this current technological civilization as a new historical kind of situation where it can absorb an enormous amount of innovations, because these production systems can be reprogrammed on a weekly basis, maybe even a daily basis. So innovations can always be integrated when you have robotic fabrication systems. Even think of 3D printing when in a lot of these components, not only for prototyping, but for final production. And that means you can upload the new design all the time. And that means there is no limit to the amount of innovation this technological systems can incorporate, whereas before 50 years ago, there was there was only one innovation per industry per year, and that was hard to implement because you would have to build up a whole new fixed physical infrastructure to change the product, and that is not viable. I mean, in particular, when it comes to a lot of production today is digital. So if you develop a new website, a new software, a service as software, a new app to improve the matters, I mean, they are literally can be uploaded to billions of customers within every day, or 3 times a day, if you like. And that means literally we could have millions and millions and millions of innovators, all having a chance to hit and improve lives across the globe on the click, when they upload their things. So that is this huge shift in the what I call the capacity to absorb innovation on the one hand. On the other hand, the setting free. Now we can have the full, let's say, if food production is in advanced countries by 1% of the population, and in the future less and less. And the productivity gains are actually had year on year still with less and less people and less land, because we have bioscience. And as again is knowledge, creative knowledge work in the city centers, reprogramming the fertilizers and the sophisticated robot tractors to generate more productivity. That's a new condition. And I've been always looking at, and that means we have a totally new societal dynamic, not only a totally new urbanism, but also a totally new, we should have a revolution in the political systems. And that's very important, something which isn't always heeded in the libertarian discourse, that historical perspective. That yes, maybe liberty and libertarian concept were always possible, were always a good idea to some extent, but they're more urgent and necessary now, when we have this kind of new level of complexity and dynamism. That when Hayek was right in the 40s to say there's millions of products, nobody can know them and understand them, they can't be centrally planned. Well, in that period, they could to some extent still be centrally planned, because it was maybe 150 products and not 150 billion products. So there is historical transformations make this project of libertarian political revolution much more urgent than they've ever been. So I think we need to look at these things historically, and if socialism was kind of semi-possible, was a bad idea in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, it is certainly an absolutely impossible system for the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and the 21st century. There's a massive, let's say, shift in the impossibility of and futility and dreadful backwardness of socialist attempts now than it was decades ago. I mean, under Fordism, in the 1950s, you had a few things. You had the cornflakes and the washing machine and the TV with 1 or 2 channels, packaged holiday, all of that mass reproduction society, which was to some extent, a handful of mega corporations. They were themselves little states, little massive planning bureaucracies, and they could coordinate. That was still a viable condition, and now it isn't. But the politics of today are still the politics of that era. I mean, there wasn't a political revolution. There was a tinkering at the edges. There was so-called neoliberal revolution, Thatcher, Reagan, and so on. But they pushed a little bit, but that got very, very quickly re-ossified, renormalized, and we have this huge contradiction of a interventionist state who is ever more pompous and arrogant and demagogic and populist in its claims, and the increasing impossibility of really doing anything but hamper, harm, inhibit, and put the brakes on the development. And imagine this scandal of living through that kind of AI revolution, AI empowered, robotics empowered, internet empowered civilization, and Europe, and we have literally across Europe zero productivity growth in a decade. And that's what we're getting. And we're getting in Japan negative productivity growth in 3 decades. I mean, that's crazy nonsense. And nobody's talking about it. It's kind of it is clear for me it's clear where those barriers lie. So I mean, it's interesting what happens. Maybe before we go more into kind of political discourse, I just wanted to lighten up the scene, and maybe I share my screen, and you can see what we could potentially create if we had all the planners out of the way, and we would allow a kind of market-based, free urban flourishing with entrepreneurship and architects, freely exploring their talents and new capacities. Should I do that?
Go ahead. Brighten up the day.
Okay, let's see what we're getting here, what we're finding here. Ah, I think we're going here. Yep. Oh, okay. I didn't want to start here, but can you see that video moving? Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So this is all right. This is this kind of open, infinite interior urbanism of kind of incubator startup urban district I've been imagining with my students here at the AA. This is one of those interiors, and the idea here is that the network society requires intervisibility, inter-awareness, and also a lot of transformation, flexibility. I think I let this run because if I speak, I'm slowed down. So these are the kind of projects we're proposing, very open and integrating existing building, tying in with residences, maybe including workspaces, co-living, co-working, and overriding in a way the kind of typological and planning and zoning strictures you have at the moment, and utilizing central urban spaces in the most value enhancing and life enhancing way possible, and not letting the politicians at the moment holding back a lot and keeping the city very actually low density. I'll show you later a much more high density project as well. But this is the kind of idea of high density layered conditions, and we also try to go out into the urban space and bleeding out. This would also require, in a way, privatizing the urban space. Like private streets, private squares, private gardens, so you can actually fully utilize it. You don't have a kind of political block. This also shows that we're going to be living with robotic systems, with AI infested, spontaneous, creative, congenial architectural elements which live together with us, not waiting for instructions, but coming in with their own spontaneous utility. So this work is also looking at social organization, but also looks at decision-making processes. And so trying to simulate social situations from the bottom up and not go by the kind of top-down rule book of prescribed types. Now in Germany, it's particularly crazy. None of this will be feasible because you can only be up to 6 feet away from a window with a view. It makes for very shallow spaces. Also an enormous amount of potential in terms of density of occupation. You can also see that this kind of space is not based on physical control, hence no walls, no locks, but movement could attack electronically, right? But I also think that free society, we are living very soon in a society, could live in a society without any violence, without any physical police.
Patrik, you're sometimes cutting out, so sometimes it is difficult to hear you while the video is playing.
Okay, yeah. I wait for. Okay, so this is one kind of. I'm just going to go to the beginning also wanted to show this. Yeah, this is a kind of architecture with integrating into urban fabrics. Several of these would intertwine, come together. A lot of activation of all the urban and in-between spaces as well. A courtyard, so something which doesn't respect the current boundaries and allows the urban texture. You could have a development process where you have landowner associations, or like in the 18th century, private planning through the great estates, where you can develop a kind of coherent value proposition. And I think the real if there is collective action, and sometimes you could also have it really bottom up through kind of raw and free and wild market process. You discover a lot of synergies and potentials, but you have friction and you also have profit and loss and wastage. So you could also think of more curated offerings. Those protagonists, the political inverted commas protagonists, I think for city development shouldn't be the general populace who has no understanding and no knowledge and no time to concern themselves with urban development questions, planning questions, but it would have to be the landowners or developers, those urban entrepreneurs who would actually be on behalf of the end users' interests, which would feed directly into their monetary profit and loss interests. They would be the ones who would be politically, collectively in the free negotiation of their shared interest. Deliver, and that would also be possible if there's a handful of those, not millions of those. You at transaction cost wise, it would be possible. And this, the way I foresee a kind of very different democracy, which isn't majoritarian dictates of a bunch of clowns elected once every 4 years without everybody knowing what they're voting for, offering a bundle of everything they're in charge of. You have in each industry, in each zone, in each kind of domain and market, you have a number of key players. And if they need to regulate industry standards or overcome, let's say, negative externalities, they're in a much better position to do so. And they would indirectly represent the commonweal for all the end users who they would have to care for if there's only one route for them to flourish, which is through satisfying end users and all of us, rather than lobbying the government to protect them from the consequences of their incompetency, let's say. So I just want to show, the other project we're now looking at is these kind of high density urban clusters. I mean, there's one interesting zone in London, which is the financial sector, the city of London, where you get these kind of densities, and now we're looking at expanding that. Interesting that London, the constitution of the city of London is actually still the medieval estates. It's not universal suffrage. It is actually the bankers and the lawyers. They have their kind of livery societies, the architects and engineers and haberdashers and other crafts that no longer exist. They have representatives. They're sent into a kind of parliament, and they elect the Lord Mayor, and they actually have this kind of democracy makes sense. It's a kind of like in Hong Kong a little bit. There's residues of this too, and because of that particular politics, you don't have that NIMBYism, you don't have the prevention of everything. You actually have an incredibly dynamic piling in and dynamism of creating an urban hothouse and high performance machine, and that needs to be looked at. And it means it's only possible there where you have the general population is excluded. I mean, it also has to do with that there are no residents in that district, and unfortunately they had to take the decision to keep residents out, because if you let residents into this, they will become kind of obstacles, because they will then feel empowered to stop everything in this kind of NIMBYism condition. They will want to have, once they've moved in, they wanted to freeze it up and think that they can use the political mechanisms to cement their supposed privileges. And I think that's, of course, horrendous for a city if every district says, not in my backyard, nothing happens everywhere. So London is trying for 40 years now to build a third runway. There's not going to be a single new airport in Western Europe. Etc., etc., etc. So the city of London is interesting, and here we're talking about some vision about a very high density urbanism we can imagine to be between the city of London and Canary Wharf, and we be experimenting with this with students in a multi-author condition where we're not having one single master plan, but we have many different students bringing in their piece, but looking for resonances and affiliations and co-location synergies with the neighbors. So the city actually acquires a certain degree of coherence through that, not according to rule book imposed, but through a kind of condition of mutual cluster formation, bottom up, through the freedom of developers to propose, and architects for the sake of developers propose solutions. So that is what we're doing with students. One quick glimpse also at this, just to entice you guys. Prosper in Honduras, the free private city, we're starting to sketch for New Way Capital, who's the developer of that, where you can now sit here and work in the city of London or for Zarid Architects or wherever you want, and you're going to be paying very next to no taxes. Employment law is suspended or reinvented. I mean, the fascinating thing about the Honduras is that program where it allows foreign investors to come in, acquire land, and bring a jurisdictional system, bring a whole judiciary process as well, not only the laws of the land, but also the judges and the processes responsible for maintaining law and order, as well as defining what that would be in a place like this. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And Honduras is doing this because they've been so kind of held back by corruption and violence and problems in development that they actually brought that in, this idea of a chartered city, and it's a tough one to pull off, but I think the team is reaching somewhere and establishing a jurisdictional system, common law, as well as building up a judiciary and inviting people to come here to join a free city and buy in and build networks and entrepreneurship. This could be a new financial center, perhaps for the whole of the Central America, kind of Hong Kong of Central America. And this is just we getting in with these kind of images, and we also want to do an online configurator where you can virtually pre-build as people kind of buy shares and virtually place themselves before they place themselves real to forge and form a kind of a synergetic network virtually already, and you can then kind of make the shifts and changes and adjustments before you build. And you have a kind of virtual market process, simulation process, and then it's all about rapid prefabrication of kit-off parts. And there's always kind of also a lot of high technology ideas which come together, and also trying to be kind of adaptive to local climates, local materials, and developing something attractive for kind of global entrepreneurial class. Initially, I'm sure there will also be a lot of libertarian enthusiasts who will come in. I think that project is taking up speed. It took a while to get off the ground, but the political framework is set. And with this, the first sites and that investment, you could later on, in fact, other landowners and people in the region could also self-select into this jurisdiction and participate in the advantages of these freedoms, and also these forms of, let's say, judicial security, which will be on offer. So I think it's a fascinating condition. And I have another friend who's trying to pull off a kind of free enterprise zone of a similar kind in the UK, but it's a very, very difficult battle. I mean, the problem is, of course, this, that there is no space on planet Earth, which, that's why Patrik Freeman, who's actually also related to this to some extent indirectly, has this kind of seasteading project. So you have to go remote to find a spot where you're outside of the reach of the state, or you have in India in a kind of political vacuum something cropping up. But the problem is, of course, that these projects are hampered by their remoteness. And yes, you can compensate, you bring the advantage of freedom, but you have the disadvantage of, lack of being tied in. But if the civilization moves more virtual, then this becomes more viable. And so I'm hopeful about that in the kind of post-corona condition, particularly because I believe that, and that's maybe also something we can discuss, the mistakes which are currently made in terms of further bailouts, further subsidies, indiscriminate bailouts of everybody who should go bust, that should have been gone bust in the last 5 years, is going to be unsustainable in Europe, probably unsustainable in America in the medium term, in England perhaps also. So we're gonna hit and see major dislocations, major economic crisis, in particular if they're trying to freeze it up and fix it with money pumping and subsidies and big carving into those who've been hardworking and saving. Those the ones who are smart, who have some savings. They're going to be asked to pay up. They're going to put, as you might know, special wealth taxes on everybody who still have something. That will push people out, and might push also people to revolt to some extent. And I don't want to ask you guys what you think of Markus Krall and this idea of a bourgeois revolution. If you're discussing that in Students for Liberty, this kind of prospect of those who actually delivering through their skill and hard work and effort and keeping these economies running, they're the one who are kind of beaten up by the zero interest policy. They're kind of milked dry. They're now they're going to be further hampered by additional wealth tax, but also all the activities are hampered by all this red tape. I mean, and if they become unprofitable, they can't let their staff go. They can't kind of slim down. They can't adapt because the costs of letting people go are becoming ever more onerous and virtually impossible. So I think we're freezing up in Europe, and that means a bourgeois revolution in Europe, or an escape to these kind of territories increasingly where there is, I mean, for instance, some place like Singapore, they're kind of growing, and other places those places who at first will bring a certain degree of freedom, they will kind of have the first mover advantage. They will flourish and then find a lot of imitators too. Great, so I think that's what I can pitch it, and maybe I get out of this. Look how nice you could kind of set yourself up in a cluster of like-minded entrepreneurs and escape the kind of Leviathan, the kind of zombie economies of Europe. Wait, let me see how I can no. Get rid of sharing my screen. Stop share. Let's see. Yeah. Let's have a discussion.
All right, let's do it. So my first question was pretty much tying into what you said in the later part of your presentation, which is how do you see the sclerotic legislation in Europe changing, if you see them changing at all? Do you see that come about by basically the guys who are actually the individuals who are carrying society leaving, and it comes to like an Randian Atlas Shrugged style strike at the end of the day, or do you see that by, for example, some uprisings or civil disobedience within those states? How do you picture that?
Well, I think there's a number of things. I mean, I like the Atlas Shrugged. I think the Atlas initiative of Krall is referring to that, because he's talking like that. I haven't seen it explicitly explained like this, but that is part of it. It's actually happening. I mean, the amount of Germans, high-skilled and entrepreneurial Germans who are escaping from this kind of sclerotic stranglehold is significant. A lot of them end up in London. I'm like myself. The city of London is full of Germans, and all the major architectural firms here, things I know, they're full of Germans. But they also go to Australia, to the US, everywhere else where there's the best and brightest will escape from Europe. I mean, it's a scandal what Europe is doing. I mean, and Eric Brimmen, who is the mastermind together with Titus of Honduras Prosper, he's also pointing out, look at Israel. They can see what's possible. In 9 million people generating more NASDAQ listed enterprises than the whole of Europe, you know, the whole of kind of 400 million of Europeans, you know, a new country which just, you know, and had only a handful of decades out of its kind of existence and embattlement. That shows the way, simply speaking. I mean, it's a scandal. Europe is so part of it is, yes, the best and brightest will, particularly if this is now getting more harsh, then you'll see a lot of that. But I think ultimately they will cling on, and I think it really will be that deep crisis will shake things up only finally. I mean, they're not reforming anything. I mean, Krall is talking about the banking sector eroding. The stock listed value of these major banks is already far, far less. It's a small fraction of the supposed kind of a book value, which shows also that the banking authorities are complicit in basically accounting fraud. That these banks have no chance to have renew their earnings because there is no, you know, in a zero a negative interest environment where there's only, you know, you can't earn in that model. You can't also fire your people because that would be more expensive in the first 2 years, and that's too long a process in terms of compensations for staff, etc., and also social indicators you have to call. You can't reduce cost, you can't earn money. You're driving down you have at the moment, you have a lot of kind of last ditch fixes of drawing down reserves, and you have at the same time accumulation of these zombie companies who have been not failing. I mean, that environment of zero interest rate and bailouts and subsidies meant that we didn't have all these business failures we should have had. Far less business failures in the last 10 years than there should have been. So this is an accumulation of firms who should not exist. But also, if you don't have a healthy turnover of business, you can't start new business because there's nobody available. And everybody's so scared and hanging on to their jobs as well. So that's going to happen. So I think we'll run into a huge crisis, the banking crisis, then there'll be the nationalization of these banks. And then when the zombie economies have to be bailed out, the money pumping will not be sustainable. The euro will break up, or you have hyperinflation on the horizon. Something like this will happen. I don't know how bad it will become, but it will become traumatic enough, and you will start to have also, of course, then you start have unrest. I mean, if you see the yellow vests in France, months on months and months, this kind of spirit of rampaging and venting frustration and just screaming loud because they don't understand the world, that they're just but it's a small, there's very little tolerance. A kind of small reduction of their costs through this environmental tax, brings a lot of resentment out. And you have these kind of protests in many, many places. And I've seen them here as well. And I predict them here. I've seen it a number of years ago here in terms of massive protests with lootings and so on in the city of London. I mean, I don't know where this all leads. It's very, very difficult. So I think it will probably lead into an interim period. There will be an ideological battle, initially going into a more hardened quasi-socialism, because they have no other way to deal with it. They will nationalize, they will redistribute and have a kind of socialism. But of course, this means lowering everybody's standard of living, but at least equally, you all become equally poor. And those who can escape will escape. This is not sustainable. This will mean we'll end up in the 70s quite quickly, with inflation picking up, price controls, ever harder taxes, so everybody becomes a tax evader, a benefit fraudster. And you have in the end, in the 70s in London and England, they couldn't even maintain electricity for more than several hours for a few days in the week. This is the kind of conditions which will finally mean you have a revolution, that bourgeois revolution Krall will be talking about, will happen at that point, but you don't know which way it could go. It's also very risky. In France, it might go fascist. So, and it's digging a yet deeper hole. And eventually there's only one way out. But, you know, you could also have societies degenerating altogether. Look at Venezuela. I mean, this becomes a monstrous kind of corrupt and dictatorial degenerateness, which is tragic. Venezuela was one of the highest globally developed countries in the 50s and 60s, based on a liberal economic economy, you know, on par with Britain and other European countries. And look what kind of a hellhole you've descended into, where you have you know, a really kind of breakdown of economy and society. I'm not saying this will happen in Germany, but it could happen in quite a few European countries. You get a very, very dire conditions. So the hope is that one can avoid that and turn around earlier, like Thatcher was able to turn around in England. But you can imagine that Thatcher could only have come to power because things got so dire, with literally garbage piling up in streets, unemployment rampant, inflation 17%, people lost all their savings. You had literally a kind of crisis point. That's what I see. But at that point, we have to be ready. And then a little bit like I became a libertarian because I could look back on in 2008 at the libertarian movement and economists and analysts who had actually predicted that scary meltdown which we saw, and so they gave an enormous credibility for me to those, and I think now we have figures who have been in the libertarian movement. I mean, it's again the same characters and new ones as well, who are warning, who are predicting, who are analyzing, who build up, who are now nobody's listening to, because nobody is realizing what's happening. I think it can continue like this when it can't. And then when these voices step forward and make a political movement and a claim for opinion leadership, and then maybe even political leadership, they will have a credibility. At some point it will become clear, where all the other groups are exhausted and let's say morally and intellectually the bankruptcy is kind of open to see, and there's no it becomes clear that a kind of socialist takeover of nationalizing everything is. Then you also in Germany you have of course the new Bundesländer. There's a kind of vivid memory of the impossibility of a socialist economy, and we had actually the revolution. There's a lot of revolutionary of that period of the late 80s and early 89, when it finally broke through. We have those people still in our society in Germany. I don't know in England and other places. So that's what I see. I see a kind of ideological confrontation, a strong polarization, which most probably goes socialist first in the crisis, but then it only shows, it digs itself deeper, and then we're coming out. And I believe the once you have a proper free society, a proper activating the processes of a free society, you can, in a few years, you're out of that. Look at the German miracle. Out of hour zero, when Erhard took over and scrapped all the price controls and regulations and the war economy, and you had within a few years you had the so-called economic miracle, and that's what we're going to see eventually. Right. But we need to be prepared, and we need to build the cadres, and we need to build the political movement to make that happen.
All right. Let me shift the discussion a little bit more towards what is currently happening in the realm of of urban planning and stuff like this. I once saw a debate with you actually at Texas A&M University, where you were discussing what you will your thoughts on market urbanism with Mark Foster Gage actually, and he was definitely not of your opinion. And you were basically saying that Texas A&M, which for the listeners is really like in the middle of Texas, is not put in the right place. And he argued that it's such a great research university and everything, and only government can do that. And you said, well, it's basically a misallocation of money. And as a former student of Texas A&M, I can tell you the position of it is very suboptimal, to put it at the least. But what is your opinion? What is the biggest misallocation, or what is the biggest distortion that government currently causes in urban planning?
Well, it's one of the tragedy is the real estate market and the built environment is one of the biggest market. And like if you look at everybody's wealth, personal wealth, most of it is locked up in their houses if they have some. But it's an enormous amount of the overall wealth is actually real estate. That's one thing. A lot of saving investment goes into that. It's a large part of our income, which we also have to dedicate to that. And we're willing to dedicate to that. So that's first of all, the enormous importance. And for instance, in London, a young professional is now willing to give 80% of his salary to be located with sufficient proximity, not so much looking at the quality of life, just to be part of that hub, because they know they have to be networked up and be close and be quick to walk between the office, the pub, the school, the exhibition opening, and so on. And that's what they're willing to do. I mean, and also you'll see if you have more affluent characters, what do I reflect on? What is, if I had an ambition to work harder, if I wanted to, not only for the thrill of it, but also where I feel where I could be more comfortable. It's always, I would maybe situate more centrally, more beautifully, with a larger place. That's, they're not going to have, I don't even have a car. I have a sort of fifth car, or have more expensive, fancy clothes. So none of this means much. The only thing which in the end, once you reach a certain threshold of affluence, what cares, where you could always get more satisfaction and reward, is in the living conditions, the way you live and work, the beauty of these spaces, the location, and the comfort. That's where I think prosperity is real. And if that becomes kind of socialized, if that becomes kind of clamped down, where these choices are not made available, you're actually not allowed to buy and improve because the bureaucrats simply put a ban on it. That's real existential prosperity prevention. And it also puts a lid on, to some extent, as if you had reached certain affluence, if you can't get more, and it's not really about, you can't just have, 5 standard apartments. That makes no sense. You want a great, gorgeous place, bigger, better, more sophisticated, and that's simply not allowed. And it also shows this, that this market, of course, it makes, first of all, simply the products you would like to work for and live by are not there. They're simply prevented. Second, everything is made so much more expensive through the supply restrictions, through the imposition of standards, because you either can afford all these luxuries which the government prescribes you must have to be have a decent life, and then you have to give 80 or 90% of your salary, or simply can't come to these places. So you're kind of forced to stay away, and you're kind of stifling your own career and self-development because you can't move into London. Or you actually, what they can't control, you're actually living in a flat share where you're living in a former toilet and pay 50% of it. So, but they prevent everything else. So that's a massive, massive infringement. First of all, keeping people out of the city. That means their careers and whole self-development is stunted because they have to make the choice to stay in some kind of provincial nest cut off. And that's where they're subsidized. They shift money continues from London into all these kind of provinces to keep people kind of subsidized and unproductive. I mean, that's also a huge cost. But so there's not only that the prevention of proper development in the centers where everybody would want to work and live, but also wasting of building roads to nowhere in the provinces to keep people happy there. But they're going to be unproductive and subsidized. So it's a massive, massive on every level infringement. So for instance, you have a land use map and this is just frozen for decades, nothing changes. Here is office, here is retail, here is residential. And you can want to convert an office space into residence? No, it's not possible. They also want to freeze up milieu protection. So at some point, a random distribution of employment numbers and types of employment, a certain milieu, which emerges at some point when there's the idea that they want to protect and freeze it up and put it in the freezer. And then you can't, could build even an office building which doesn't have the same amount of employees of a certain character and ilk. There's also this kind of strange thing that this kind of diversity nonsense that you have to have a certain number of every kind of occupation. You freeze a certain condition, and there now have to be, a certain number of XYZ key workers or so living in this district, no matter whether they're actually part of that network and have to be close to the evening lecture, or whether they're cleaners and they have the whole evening to commute home. And so this is just totally ideologically frozen up and fucked up, frankly speaking, and dysfunctional. And that's why you have, it's really on every level. It gets ever more regulated. I mean, it's the location of the washing machine, the fact that you have to have a washing machine in the house, and the size of every room, every corridor, the number of apartments on the core, the provision of a balcony, whether you want it or not, the distance between buildings, which makes things less dense. Even a totally new development where you have no existing, let's say, infringement on existing politically resistant neighbors, they're deciding whether it's appropriate or not appropriate to overlook each other. Maybe you want to look in somebody else's, or you want to present yourself on the balcony to your friends and others. But anyway, you don't want to pay double to not have that. Maybe you're willing to pay, you're happy if you could pay less and draw the curtain if somebody else opens the window. So this is just this nannyism. I mean, the problem is it just makes everything super expensive and kills supply and pushes people out into these flat shares and other conditions, onto commuting nightmares. And I mean, it's an unimaginably huge infringement of quality of life, of productiveness of life, of a sense of prosperity, because most of us can afford the hamburger, and it's not going to be the difference. The real difference is these living conditions, that you have to sweat into in a horrible underground for an hour rather than living elegantly walking across to the office, that you have to live in this former toilet instead of having a nice co-living space where entrepreneurs give it to you. The entrepreneurs have it on the table and give you that life for what you can afford. And instead they're saying no, they want to kind of protect you from these choices and force you back into the toilet because they never consider this. They're saying, well, we only have to give certain standards. And now they're at that point where they ration out and hand out and distribute 50% of all new residential production. And of course, it is not to the poor. The distribution goes to the median voter, let's say the marginal voter, which is exactly always on the tilt between voting conservative or labor. That's this kind of average income, or slightly above a median income of 50, 60,000 pounds, up to 90,000 pounds. You can actually get social provision up to 90,000 pound income. Average income is in London is 30,000, up to 90,000. You can get a lot of these benefits and subsidies, and that's what actually all this rationing is pushed towards, not to the kind of to the poor and let's say needy, and they're actually always spoiled for this, but to this group which they're voting for, and it's just making everybody's life much more frustrating, much less prosperity. And this is just in this market. It's one of the most politicized market, one of the most dysfunctional market. And we can imagine how nice and more uplifting it could be. And as I said, we care much more about this. Let them regulate the fashion market and prescribe certain kind of healthy shoes to everybody. Fine. I mean, that's something we could easier live with than with having, where you live and work and walk and move being kind of totally compromised.
Yeah, I definitely see that coming from Berlin as well, where it's almost impossible to build anything in Berlin anymore. It takes ages. You know, you have to pay everybody in this time. Um, since these regulations do not seem to change in the next couple of years or even decades before the big crash, I can see that there is some entrepreneurs are trying to work their way around it. And this also ties in into a question from the chat, which is basically how do creative workers who now discover in COVID that they can actually work from remotely, how do they do that, and how do you, for example, see your role as an architect changing in those times?
Well, I mean that this puts a little bit of the pressure off to some extent. And as I said, you could even sit in another country and don't have a visa to participate. That's all that is great. But again, this also, the market would have to discover what that means for those residences out there, these suburban houses, and the way where you can run your business from that house as a self-employed worker or something. And instead of and of course there's enormous restrictions there. You have a lot of that. And in China, again, there was a period where it is much more free when they had this kind of entrepreneurial takeoff, where you had a building where you could set up an office or a residence or a shop, whether it's a barber shop, a photographer studio, anywhere in the building on any floor. Is again, of course, as well, you do your you convert your house into a photo studio or work environment, and you then might also want to invite another employee to join. All of this is going to require a scrapping of all these legislations, because even if you stay in the suburb and you want to work from there, to make an extension to your little to your garden extension, you need you must wait you fight with your neighbors for 3 years also, because property isn't what it used to be, and you might need licenses and problems, and you're not allowed to have somebody joining you at work in your apartment. It's just going to be very, very difficult. So in all directions, these kind of thrilling new opportunities, which seem to be easier to then just do that, will also be interfered with by government very, very quickly, and they have to loosen up there. And eventually they will. I mean, they're coming around, for instance, on co-living, but they don't let the markets continue to discover which versions and ways of co-living are viable, and what the diversity of such co-living types might become available. But they're coming in and want to freeze up one model they found and discovered. And then I want to describe minimum unit sizes, the minimum number of shared spaces on each floor. They want to prescribe that they have the linen service, which currently has been become part of that offering, has to be obligatory offered in the future, and you then can only live there not less than 3 months. You have to kind of live there more than 3 months, and there's going to be they kill everything by over-regulating it instantly, and that means they take out all the entrepreneurial creativity. All what those variations are precisely what an entrepreneur would have to bring to the market. A new type of house. You offer a new residence which has integrated, video studio and etc., second entrance, and where you can have when you have a client can park there. All of that is going to be very, very difficult, and that's the kind of tragedy of these regulators. And it is truly demagogic, because it's a political class wanting to maintain relevance. And they just hate that somebody's doing something which is not under their spell, under their control, under their kind of generous signing off. They won't allow it, they won't have it. Everything is blocked. And if they considered something, they have to kind of regulate it so that there's no space left. And that means, and that's the way it is in architecture. And all these various players in the market, they cannot compete on product, because the product is prescribed and frozen up. So what they're actually competing on is on on insider trading, on knowing the councillors, on brown-nosing the councillors, on special knowledge about planners, their predilections. So only local infected people can come in. And there is a whole industry of let's say, lobbyist-style planning consultants who are, their expertise is precisely that they know the councillors and planners in every borough, and it's all rent-seeking competition, and there's no product-based competition. That makes things more expensive. That's how fucked up it is. I mean, and so I see, yes, I do see that there's new opportunities, that there's, in particular, if the whole market becomes more fluid, where it's not only there's mobility with all these, Uber, and where the government tried to prevent as well in many places, Germany in particular. I mean, they found new deals where, micro mobility, which is prohibited in London, new kind of forms of live, work, residences, and so on. The problem is that the government will, we need to win that game, that it's just crazy to everybody who is, I mean, there's kind of belief in the state and in the government doing the right thing for us, and this kind of ludicrous fright that if you open up entrepreneurial freedoms, that will be used to fuck over everybody, and would kind of force people to buy shit, fake and false products. Nobody can force anybody to buy anything. I mean, exactly, this kind of idea means this. We have to win this ideology. And we have to crack that up, because it's a kind of seeded by a political class who obviously is paranoid of losing their power in a system which has degrees of entrepreneurial freedom and individual decision-making freedom, where we don't need these clowns to prescribe us everything. That's the danger. But they obviously have at the moment ideologically the upper hand. But I think it's the facade is kind of cracking and crumbling. Precisely because of groupings like Students for Liberty.
Let me jump in right there, because that's really interesting. A very common objection against the free market is that, once you privatize something, stuff will turn more expensive. And there is also a related question in the chat. It's like, how does urban planning under market urbanism include the very poor who cannot afford basic sanitation and everything like that, and which I found very interesting. Those are like questions that need to be answered, right?
Well, first of all, there shouldn't be anybody who can't afford basic things. I mean, that is only because the whole kind of, I mean, that's a discussion that will come, and we'll be back to it later, that we have infantilized and give so wrong incentives and have whole milieus which are kind of excluded from the labor process through a kind of welfare dependency. That's actually the only ones who actually can't afford. Everybody else who's working can afford everything we would ever want to afford if the government got out of the way. Let me give the example, for instance.
Let me jump in right there real quick. In the question, it was actually specified that we're talking about developing countries which do not have this welfare state, and who are also having the poor basically living in favelas and stuff like that.
Well, so okay, I'll come to that as well. The development country, by the way, the big tragedy of the whole post-colonial era was that it happened when there was a hegemony of socialism economically. So all these leaders came from the London School of Economics. There was still this kind of absolute intellectual hegemony of socialism. We had planned economies all over Europe, Eastern Europe. So all these states were set up post-independence in the 60s, 70s, under the kind of pretense that you could centrally plan these economies. And remind you, at that time, it was seen more or less possible, a simple industrialization program, but it wasn't possible. The result was everywhere a kind of falling curve of prosperity, a kind of negative prosperity development everywhere, tragically, because they thought it was, well, no matter how much aid, I mean, it wasn't that much, but for the local countries, a relative percentage of aid pumping in made things even worse, this dependency and corruption. That was a huge tragedy. And only in recent decades, you find actually what was first called the third world, you have a lot of development always and without exception based on market liberalization. That India finally turns the corner. China is the biggest example, but many other examples as well. Israel turned from socialist to market economy and is a kind of in the stratosphere of takeoff. That's a general experience in these countries. It's actually the statism is, and so-called democratic control of resources is horrendously corrupt in all these countries. I mean, in India particularly, there's simply not the mechanisms to do that. What was possible in Europe at a certain level, you should reach through a market and capitalist development. You could afford for a few years, some in Sweden, even a few decades, some degree of a kind of democratic economy. But in the end, all of them crumbled and had to reverse course. The third world can't afford that at all. It just generates poverty, corruption of the worst order. So that's, I think we have to look carefully at the third world and everything which goes on positively. For instance, that there is some degree of education in Africa and India is precisely, even in the favelas, education, which is actually learning, reading and writing the basics, is privately delivered. There's a wonderful book, the kind of the beautiful tree, exploring that the poor has really given up, the urban favela poor have given up sending their children to state schools. And that's universally found in Latin America, in India, in Africa, and the poorest of poor. They realize if they send their kids to a state school, after 5 years, after 10 years, they can't even read and write. So they rather have a kind of grassroots favela entrepreneur, not a properly educated teacher, certified, but they're actually learning something useful and they're willing to pay. And that's not expensive, but to send somebody in the state school where every single teacher is not showing up and all these public sector jobs are basically fiefdoms, which they subcontract for a fraction of their salary to a mender who comes in and kind of controls the children for a few hours a day. That's what you're getting in these places. These public systems are absolutely atrocious, and a huge rent-seeking machine and a poverty creation machine. So we can't rely on that simply. You can have ideas, how wouldn't it be wonderful to centrally plan and redistribute? First of all, the problem of poverty is there is that lack of capital, the lack of skill, of human capital, of physical capital, of productivity. So you simply can't. And actually all these socialist machines are redistribution machines. They're atrocious and they're keeping these countries back. Now, when it comes to the most advanced countries, I would say that, for instance, look at the privatization programs that happened in the 80s and 90s, making things cheaper. You know, flying was exclusively the privilege of the elites, of the well-to-do and the upper middle class, until there was finally privatization of the airspace. It was just monopoly and they were inefficient and overpriced and state privilege. Monopoly is a kind of royal privilege you give to some suppliers to rip off society and protect it from competition. And it makes everybody poorer, and makes every product bad and expensive. And actually the privatization of the airline industry delivered that everybody literally can fly now in Germany. And they're flying all the time. Last minute flights for 20 quid or 50 quid or 40 euros. Everybody is flying around Europe. And it's, except that if you are somebody who is unwilling to do anything and just being kind of live free riding kind of from 15 to 75, but even they can fly. So you don't have to do much to participate in this. And the same as with, let's say, the media industry. I mean, you had kind of 1 or 2 TV channels, and now the flourishing is that you have thousands of channels for free. Well, welcome. How free market makes things expensive for you. On and on and on. It's just been the opposite is the case, and everything. The same would be with housing. Quite frankly speaking, if you had a free market, a proper free market, without allowing NIMBYism and political groups to rent seek and monopolize what they're sitting on through preventing competition, everybody could have a piece of every great city in an affordable way. Affordable not for somebody who's unwilling to do anything or who's been kind of brought up in a milieu of dependency and which is, I think, is the biggest kind of poison chalice and tragedy, the truest tragedy of mistake of left liberal policies Everybody who is willing to seek out opportunities can participate in all the great amenities which an urban environment would offer. So I think that every immigrant population, from wherever they come from, whether they speak English or not, coming to America or England, and if they can get a life and flourish within a few years, if they because when they first come there, they're not allowed that option of sitting back. So I think that's absolutely wrong. It's absolutely untrue that the market and privatization would make things expensive. It's the absolute opposite is the case in every single arena. And if you find problems and overpricedness, then usually you can trace it back to state intervention, to government protection, to people using the political system to protect them from competition, to insist on privileges and monopolies. And that's everywhere. I mean, there's ludicrous. I mean, you know that you have to get a government license and you have to go to a government licensed school to offer a haircut. I mean, that's everything is ossified in these kind of granted privilege. I mean, florists, you have to be kind of a certified florist to sell a flower on the streets of London or Germany. So, I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And once you, for example, check out the development of prices of certain goods and services, almost throughout every single goods and services, the price has been decreasing, with several exceptions, which is housing, which is education, and which are basically only industries which are either monopolized by the state or heavily regulated by the state. So if you're willing to look that up, you will soon find that the free market actually is a guarantor of low prices and high quality. There is another.
The main thing is you need to understand that the problem is the state is usually, and you know that logic, is protecting never the general population as consumers, but always coming in to protect producers.
Yep.
And because you always have that concentrated, let's say, benefit and the dispersed cost, and that inevitably always comes in, whether it's with tariffs and barriers, with licensing laws. So it's the doctors, the teachers, all the firms, everybody is going to the state to freeze up and protect competition to the detriment of every consumer. And the strange thing is nobody realizes that if you work in a certain industry, you're pro this protection because you feel a little bit better, but it's only a small fraction of benefit. And in all the other industries, you're losing. So as a consumer in your whole life, you're a loser. It's always a losing argument to go for these policies. But the media are dominated with this. And if you look at education, it's precisely that the politicians going with the teachers union and protecting only the teachers and making them easy. I mean, it is impossible to fire a teacher. It costs $500,000 in the US to get rid of an incompetent teacher. You can, they have rules like the first hired are the first to be fired as in a downsizing. If you can't be fired, then you kind of come in and do nothing for the rest of your life. I mean, the cost of education and the unwillingness to have any feedback, any kind of performance coming in, that's why education is crap. It's super expensive. So it's actually the big industries which we all really would love to have enhance our life. It's education. It's a big ticket in our lives. A large part. Sometimes you spend for several years you spend a lot of education. Health, exploding. I mean, 30% of the whole GDP in the US is now health, and housing. Let's say these three are so politicized, and I promise you that in all these arenas you're talking doubling of cost for you, or halving the prosperity and benefits you could have at minimum. And this is a huge chunk of your whole well-being is kind of compromised. These are not markets at all. I mean, it's so funny the way they're always talking about the American health system as a free market, and it's a lot of atrocities are prescribed to it. It's not, bears no semblance to it. is not a free market whatsoever. And libertarians understand that there's a lot of discourse on health economics, and it is not a market at all. And that's why it's so super expensive, and it still excludes so many people and makes it, for those who are not insured, astronomically expensive. And but a market wouldn't have that. A market would, entrepreneurs would solve all these problems. We know that from all the other arenas where the government has not been kind of inroading and taking over so much. So there is absolutely no way that you can sell me that meme that privatization is hurting the general population or hurting the so-called vulnerable. They actually have so many vulnerable people is only due to the state. We wouldn't have that.
Correct. There is another question in the chat, which I, as a layman, might not be able to understand, but I'll give it a go. Could the tectonic
Let somebody else
articulation?
come in. Let's see what the audience is saying.
All right. Yeah, that's what I'm asking that question.
Okay.
So, could the tectonic articulation concept be applied to integrate the philosophical principles of anarcho-capitalism into architectural design?
Well, the way it feeds in is simply that, look, modernism was based on central planning and the mindset of central planning. And the contemporary network society, bottom-up, emergent processes and market processes based on individual freedom and degrees of freedom. So that would show up in the tools, the methodologies, the repertoires and mindset of an architectural discourse I'm promoting. That ties in. It has to be tied in, of course. The problem is that it also outruns and anticipates a bit the society that's coming. But it's already pertinent because we are already in a different era. So we had the neoliberal revolution, which went to some extent, and in the 90s you have look at London, look at this kind of roaring agglomeration, and particular places like the City of London. So you see kind of degrees of freedom at work, and the new dynamics at work with architects has to contend with and work with. So there is a definite historical coincidence. But also outrunning that, and I'm anticipating with my architectural thinking, I'm already adapting to the next, let's say, epochal urbanization post-bourgeois revolution or post-libertarian revolution. So there's definitely an alignment. But I don't want to go too deeply into the micro processes that make this possible. But it's a mindset which I think we need to pick up in the discipline of architecture, and at the moment that hasn't quite taken place. So what we're seeing in the wild is actually an outcropping of market urbanism against and despite the ideologies which still persist in the architectural discipline. So the architectural discipline is ideologically kind of backward. And also in terms of urban planning, actually in the wild, it has very, very little power. It only could put kind of brakes on the process, but it can't shape the process in any way. If you look at the City of London, a skyline like this, nobody's ever planned that. So there's a kind of presumption that this is a result of planning. Absolutely not. The actual positive physiognomy of these places are totally market urbanism, except it's a highly compromised and less intense and less rational market urbanism, which we're seeing. But there's a pretense of planning, but you don't have to look at the skyline and own image to know that nobody could have planned it. Brasilia was planned. That's the era of a kind of centrally planned economy, state,
and it shows, yeah.
Society. That shows up, but the current London wasn't planned, and nobody's planned it. But the mentality is that this is a kind of, the great Peter Reeves, the kind of curating that chaos. No way.
All right, we have reached our 90 minutes mark. If you do you have anything which you would like us as viewers to know about your work and how we can follow you in your work, and what is your? I
was wondering if there was anybody from the audience wanted to come in.
Yeah, I already had I already had like read out some of the questions. I think we covered them all here as of now.
Okay.
But we're still obviously open for some other questions if they come.
Let's see if there's any spontaneous question. One more, I do one more. Then I have nothing else to add from my perspective.
All right, there does not seem to be any question. I have one. You talked about accelerationism, and I found it very interesting that usually it is kind of frowned upon by some people in the libertarian community because they want to have like a gradual approach towards the limitation of the state. What is your opinion about accelerationism?
Well, look, that philosophical movement of so-called accelerationism is, of course, look, I like the spirit of impatience and the spirit of imagining the human project to proliferate and discover new ways of living together, new psychologies, even individual life projects. So it's I'm kind of anti-humanist, inverted commas, in a sense that I don't believe we have a fixed human nature. And there's a kind of cultural evolution which also evolves ways of life, personalities, ways of living. It could be strange and artificial and other and technologically infused, this whole idea of self-augmentation, of cyborgism, and so on. And I have an article about this, about kind of a cyborg society, if you like, which is also more but socially driven than individually. So these sensibilities, I like them. So we shouldn't have kind of too many barriers to the imagination and think in terms of what's kind of fitting to an original and eternal human nature. So I like that of accelerationism, and I like the urgency and impatience. And I'm getting impatient because I hate this kind of last 10 years of nothing happening with all these technologies and potentials. And I don't want to have another 2 or 3 decades like this until the end of my life. Nothing happens, basically. So I like to see radical changes. I like this idea that somebody who was grew up with kind of horse carriages and a self-made life, taking a flight across the globe and watching movies and etc. So this kind of otherworldly exhilarating transformation of the human project on planet Earth and the conquering of that. So I love all of that. Now, the accelerationism as a movement is a rather kind of let's say adolescent, hyped up. It's also it's strangely lefty, and it's also comes along with this idea of a post-scarcity, and I mean it's a highly deluded and absurd and funny and non-serious in many other other respects. The actual characters under this accelerationism I can't quite take seriously. But the slogan and that sensibility of kind of forward-looking transformation, self-transformation of societies and humanity through also experimenting with new ways of entrepreneurship, of living together, working together. I love all this stuff, and that's where my spirit is. But literally, what, as I said, those guys who call themselves accelerationists are more like it borders on the science fiction. But again, science fiction could play into, but it's not a serious discourse, I believe.
All right. We do have one other question from the audience, and
well, I was just wondering if there's a lot of Germans here. What I would let me ask you, what do you think of Marcus Kroll and the bourgeois revolution? Is that discussed? Have you discussed it at the Students for Liberty? Is that something you appreciate? I mean, I know you most probably have some problems with it as well, but is it something that gives you hope? Is that an interesting force?
I have to admit that there is not a whole lot of discourse on his thesis. I'm vaguely aware of it.
Okay.
But I also I do think that Germany itself and Europe in general is heading for a I mean, I don't want to be like too dramatic here, but like a collapse at one point. and we as people who think of ourselves as entrepreneurs and as people who run the society, in the end of the day, we have to think of ways to get out. And I'm personally am thinking about it.
Up to London,
that's
guys.
for sure. That's for sure.
Exit. Yes.
All right.
Okay,
There's another question from the audience, and I'll just let you hash it out.
Hello.
Hi.
So, how a Brazilian girl, they have a lot of problems here about the corruption and how the state don't works. I just like just spoiled a bit my point. First, Brazil, we have in your history anything as socialism. And our problems here is about an historical problem since the century 18, 19 is an old thing. And my questions about the favelas is that because I have this I'm very insecure about this point with free market, most in Brazil, because since they opened the economy in 1992, a bit before the I was born, the companies don't come to Brazil not just by bureaucracy for state, but because they use the state system to get more profits and explore the people. And I like know your opinion about a urban plan. They include these people they can pay because they can't, because the salary in Brazil, the minimum salary per month in Brazil now is around 175 euros per month. And if you consider cities as São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro or Brasilia, the spends to live there and very similar the spends to live in Madrid or Rome, and maybe in some areas specific from Rio, like Leblon or Copacabana or the pilot plan in Brasilia, the things are so expensive as live in London. And imagine how you can live at a city as that with the salary per month, less than 200 euros per month. And that's my question. It's very important. I understand how you will include these people that really have a low salary. I need to say in Brazil now at this moment, around 7% of people have a salary with less of 400 euros per month. An architect as me in Brazil have the average salary like 400 euros per month. How it could be included in a free market urban plan? The entire say that everybody will be private, or you need to pay something to have access. That's my question.
Well,
thanks.
I think. Well, thanks for the question. By the way, my salary in my first study was £400 per month, and I lived in Brixton in a converted former kitchen. And I still enjoyed,
but then you start, you had
London.
my age. This is like 30 years ago.
So I was, well, I don't know that we'd be now, but it meant that but there was a prospect. I mean, the thing is, if you had a freer society, and you also need some kind of rule of law to somehow be established, and that's another discourse how, that you actually protected from expropriation, that when you save and invest, no bully, either government or mafia, can take that away from you, and then you can actually build and invest. I mean, there's a big discourse in these kind of less developed countries that you have kind of mafia-like bullying structures, where property rights and contractual rights are not safe. That's at least I know in Honduras. That's why the free private city is a huge potential and could also apply to Brazil, because we went there, for instance, to Roatan and talked to a lot of young business people and trying to do something there. They can see that it's so corrupt to get a license, even to do a kind of little brewery. They have to wait. They have to bribe people. There's enormous import tax on the machines they need, and they're really struggling. And if they had a proper set of rules and a trustworthy judiciary, a lot of things become possible. There's so many low-hanging fruits. So the reason why you have you earn only like 500 pounds per month, a lot of these people, because there's a prevention of this entrepreneurship. There's a prevention of importing machinery, of setting up businesses, of increasing productivity. But in the end, what you have to look at is productivity increases. And that can only happen when there is saving and investment. But for that, you need a kind of safe background, in particular in the development stage of Brazil. If you have to pay for licenses, if you have to bribe officials to set up a business, and then somebody else anyway comes and closes it down, also if you start earning, a large part of your money is taxed away, rather than you can keep that money and invest and build your business. That very quickly you will have rising standards of living, rising salaries, and everybody flourishing. And that's what was in Germany. Germany, after everything was smashed in ruins in 1945, within a few years.
But I need to say, in Germany, after the Second World War, have decade from welfare help for the people. And things that
there was no help. There was very little help. There was self-help, and there was a free market. Actually, the Minister of Economics of Germany of this period was pretty much a libertarian, and he pushed through the economic miracle of Germany in the post-war era was tied to a very, very strong free market program and set of policies. And that's what gave Germany the edge, and very quickly meant that Germany could overtake Britain, which took the different route. They went socialist, and Germany went free market, of course, and they were in a very different place very, very shortly. When they reached the late 60s, they were doing so well that some people thought, now we can afford socialism, and they tried that, and they also dipped down. So no, I disagree with you. I think the recipe, and that's what we're going to see in places like Honduras, perhaps, or in Brazil, hopefully, the recipe I believe in is, you can't talk about people have this salary right now and therefore they can't live. We need to allow, and if you now start, who are you going to take it from? Those who have saved a little bit to want to set up a business which allows next year to earn double. You want to take that from now and give it to the poor who are eating it up. That's where you can never develop. So you got to be patient. You got to allow a system but it doesn't take that long. It takes maybe 10 years to come out of that, massively coming out of that. But you can't do it when you look at the now and here and say all these people need kind of provisions which they're eating up during the year, and then you remain in that stagnation forever. And that's unfortunately the truth. You can't be that impatient.
So if you compare the live and Europe in general, they have, for example, public schools, some public universities, some public health system, and anything like that. In Brazil, we have since the 90s start more something, because until the 50s, the 60s, the most of the health in Brazil was totally private, and the education in Brazil, the biggest part as private too. This changed after the dictatorship in Brazil.
But let me come in. I mean, you can't attribute. Sorry? Actually, what I'm saying is, Europe would have been much better if they didn't have these provisions. If the education I believe, and you see it now, that these state schools are not delivering. Private schools are delivering.
The private schools in Brazil, we have 2 points. If you compare the high schools private, they are better the public schools. But if you compare the university and research institutes, the public are better the private. We don't know exactly the reason for that. But I need to say, when you compare the numbers, today in Brazil, around 15% of people are totally illiterate or have problems to don't have a good education around that. But if you compare when the master of education as private, you have a numbers as on 7th, and 7th, that's just 40 35-40% of people as literate. Of course, more education, you have more changes to improve your life, because you have a more chance to get a better work, and you have how improve your salary. I remember a researcher recently that 1 or 2 years the student, you increase your salary in 2% to 3%, anything like that. So in Brazil, just today, 20% of people have a bachelor, can finish the students in university. Like when I was born, like 30 years ago, it's like a 14%. We have a small increase in last 30 years, like 5-6% more people can finish the studies in bachelor, but it's a low number compared, for example, United States, like 60% of people have a bachelor, and Europe you have a 7%, depends of country, you have until 8-9%, of course.
But you cannot,
and there's a problem here. Listen, it's how to say it. The most of our best university and public and free. You don't pay any tuition. And ever with the state, given that the people don't have access. And how an urban plan, free market, private city can help that. The people live in the city, then have access, can increase that. Because you started the point that the people have money, have an institute, we just will enter that. But how this will increase and open to people that can pay for urban institute, can pay for university, can pay from health.
But let me ask you, let me ask you one thing. Who you want to take it from? If you want to keep giving to everybody for free, who you going to take it from? Who you going to take it from?
So I just think about that.
Who should work for these people to get free educations?
So why you say the private companies could pay for that, for example, give a voucher? There's an option, but they don't do. Why don't? In Brazil, for example, we have a lot of researches happen, and when you ask for the private companies to ask to give money to research, they don't want. For example, if you ask why they don't pay anything direct to state, or they don't need state, for example, a private company like Zahar say, so we have this money to make this school here. Why your company don't give it this money?
Well, look, let me finish with this. I simply don't trust and believe that a state taking money in and then setting up schools and then opening those up is working, is efficient. It's in the process, there's an enormous amount of friction and loss of resources and income and prosperity, so that you get, in the end, you get very, very little result. And the private system would have used those resources much more effectively and efficiently, with much more intricate checks and balances and continuous checking of the best utilization. And I'm convinced that this applies also to education, that you could have affordable, good schools, a much larger variety of schools, more effective schools. So the fact that education is a big part of the state budget is maybe not utilized well. And the example is, and I will stop with this, you should read this book, The Beautiful Tree, which is talking about this, with actually the poorest strata in all the developing countries of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, discovered that the real heavy lifting of education of the poorest is done by private entrepreneurial schools, bypassing the state system. The state system is not delivering. I would simply not rely on and believe that these state systems could deliver, because they're just so wasteful and corrupt that that particularly developing countries, relatively poor countries, cannot afford this amount of, let's say, friction and wastage in their systems. And that's what is the big barrier.
So,
Let's
and my
stop here
point
on that one.
is, I think that
I think we gotta put that. We continue that conversation on another time.
so
offline.
we need to do it just
You have
us
made your point
to do
Yeah.
it, because we have much to talk. And just to finish, I believe that the only free market or just the libertarian idea don't work, how the communism don't work. I think that you need a bit state, you need a bit free market to think work together. I don't believe the one or other will solve it all. I believe that I need a buff, because the buff are important to different points of society. This is
okay. Let me finish on this point. If this is a good point,
yes, this
wait,
is
let me say,
bureaucratic.
this is a good point to
sometimes.
start. This is a good point to start. And now the question I'm raising is, if we have both at the moment, which side of the equation needs to be increasing? And now, don't know Brazil, we're talking about Europe, where we have at the moment 50% of total GDP going through the government. France 57%, Germany 49%, Britain 50%. Which direction should that balance now be adjusted? And I am pretty convinced, and that's my the final word of this conversation, that we don't have to talk about 100% free society at the moment. We just need to know the direction of travel. And for me, the direction of travel is that we have to pull back the state and give more scope, resources, and freedom. And it's not only the resources, it's also decision-making powers to the individual associations, to civil society, to individuals, to firms, and so on, so that the balancing, at the moment, it's a kind of war of attrition 50-50, and 100% of nearly of economic life regulated. We need to rebalance, and we have to be clear about the direction of travel. That's fundamental. And on the left, they're saying they want more and more state, and I'm saying, let's try it the other way for the moment. Let's roll back the state. So that's the point. We only need to decide at the moment, not on final solutions, on the direction of travel. And I end with this point. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Just to
Alrighty.
say, just that's 50-50.
No, we're done.
I think we're done.
Okay. Thank you, guys. I'm leaving.
Alrighty.
Thanks. It was great. Thanks, everybody.
It was great. It was great having you. Thank you to you all and Patrik for giving this lecture. It became heated in the end, which is always appreciated by Students for Liberty. And if you want to stay tuned for our different topics, just follow our Facebook pages and stuff like that. We will tell you when we have the next debate or lecture up. And with that, I wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
All right.